students here, but also among students from many other, plethora of other institutions, and that is why we are live-streaming you. So we are very eager to listen to you. The floor is all yours.
Thank you. I'll be sitting there? Or
as you wish. Whatever you wish.
Okay.
Are you comfortable here?
I'm comfortable.
Please, what do you wish? It's okay.
No, but I have enough time. Thank you. I've been asked to speak for 40 minutes. Okay, so first of all, thank you. So I started my field work on what is called the ABC rules. I think a lot of you would be hearing about of 2001 and 2023. There was a amendment to that rule in 2023, and that's when I started my field work as well. Now, ABC rules are the rules which govern, the management of dogs in Indian cities specifically. Now, I was also kind of looking at the challenges to the implementation of ABC, why were the dogs not getting sterilized, and all that jazz. And, I was also looking at the animal keeping practices in the rural versus urban areas. So I was doing a lot of other different things. I found out several things, but what I want to start talking about today, or rather what I want to say today, is something unexpected that I encountered during the course of my fieldwork. And that was, in one EWS locality, and EWS is this economically weaker section, right? So in one EWS locality of central Delhi, I found a very high concentration of pedigree dogs. Now that was very unexpected for me, because usually pedigree dogs are, not just usually, they are expensive to buy. Their maintenance is also very expensive. Food, then medication. Some of these dogs, they don't even survive Delhi heat. So they need, air conditioning. So my question, it was interesting to me that why would, a locality where the income is modest, would people spend so much on pedigree dogs? I did not want to brush it aside as a matter of preference, and I kind of started looking at this phenomenon through decolonial studies, through post-colonial studies, and through critical animal studies. Basically, to understand how the colonial experience continues to shape our desire for animals, and specifically dogs in India. So, you know how we desire dogs, especially the pedigrees. What was the influence of this colonial experience? And I wanted to understand what exactly, because we hear so much about colonialism and breed and things like that. So I wanted to understand what exactly this was, and I'll be talking about that to begin with. Now, at the very outset, I want to first kind of distinguish between the different kinds of dogs before I come to the colonial part. The difference between stray dogs, street dogs, pets. Now, and I refer to the work of urban planner Rishi Dev, who has categorized urban dogs into 4 types. Pet dogs, semi-adopted dogs, which are commonly known as street dogs or community dogs. Then stray dogs are different than street dogs. And then there are feral dogs or semi-feral dogs. Now, each type of a dog is defined by its degree of interaction and dependency on humans. So, for example, pet dogs are fully integrated into human living spaces. Community dogs or street dogs, they share spaces with humans, but they don't enter human homes. So, the whole idea is ghar leke jao, they don't enter human homes. Stray dogs, on the other hand, have no permanent space. They have minimal human interaction unless they are domesticated by a locality through feeding, right? Then they become, a stray dog becomes a street dog, all right? And finally, there are feral and semi-feral dogs that live outside of human settlements, and they have no direct dependence on humans. Now, I'm going to kind of first just talk about this binary between the pet dog and the street dog. When it comes to the street dog, like I said, they're protected by ABC rules. Very quickly, what do these rules say? They say that sterilization, vaccination are the only legally sanctioned ways to control their population. Dog shelters will be places, ABC shelters will be places where this procedure will be carried out. Dog shelters are not permanent dog housing facilities. So that, which means that quick release facilities, you have to release the dog after the procedure is complete. At no point can a dog be relocated, killed, culled for population control. Right? So, now it is important to understand that this term street dog, that is what ABC rules, it does not say stray dog. It says street dogs. It is important because it legitimizes the existence of the dog in public spaces, right? Rather than labeling them as strays, which often implies illegitimacy. Thus, unlike in countries such as UK, US, Indian law allows dogs to exist without being owned by humans as property, right? So this is, you know, the law, okay? On the other hand, pets. Now, pets are those who share intimate spaces with humans. They live inside their homes. They're also subject to some laws, right? Pets can belong to any breed. Now, pedigree pet ownership has traditionally been associated with socio-economic privilege, what Bourdieu refers to as cultural capital. Pedigree pet ownership is a marker of social distinction. It reflects a capitalist logic in which love for pets is mediated through their breed, right? That is why you want to know what breed do you want, Labrador, whatever, this, that. So, and this breed, as we will discuss further, is a colonially constructed symbol of status, and we'll come to that eventually. So, now this pedigree dog is important, is an important concept because it shifts the focus. I don't know how many of you are familiar with the work of Donna Haraway. She's written this book called Companion Species. What she doesn't talk about is how, you know, this commodification through market, right? It enters into the relationship that we share with dogs, right? So, Donna Haraway talked about companionship, whereas pedigree dogs, you know, especially in a context like India, and especially when I see EWS members, right, purchasing these dogs, so it has to do with the capitalist logic as well. Now, it is important therefore to understand how capitalism and of course colonialism has impacted the life of both these dogs, the street dog and the pet dogs, because on the one hand, pedigree dogs are circulated as luxury goods that embody surplus value. Street dogs, on the other hand, are rendered as surplus populations. So one has surplus value, the other is a surplus population, which is devalued, managed through state biopolitics. Now, therefore, it is important to kind of begin this, you know, discussion by looking at some of the scholars who have looked at how colonialism impacted human-animal relationships. Okay, so you have somebody like Aziza Kanji. I have referred to her work. She studied European colonialism and she examines the links between colonialism and anthropocentrism. Drawing on the Saidian conceptual framework of Orientalism, she argues that the biopolitical management of people, land, flora, fauna involved creating distinctions between Europeans and non-Europeans, humans and animals, and even amongst animals, domestic versus wild, the purebred versus the mongrel, and so on. Now, her analysis highlights how the colonial discourse on animals was intertwined with narratives of racial superiority that enabled the reinforcement of colonial authority such that the control over animals and the subjugation of colonized populations went hand in hand. So, this argument is particularly important in the light of contemporary debates, because just yesterday I heard somebody say that if you are speaking for dogs, you are against the poor, because you know you're speaking from a privileged position. Kanji's work tells us that you cannot, this whole pitting of the urban poor and the dog itself is a colonial construction, because under colonial rule, animals have long borne the brunt of racial and social hierarchies in ways that are structurally continuous with the subordination of the poor. Therefore, once the animal is rendered disposable, once the animal goes, the same logic of expendability extends to vulnerable human populations. Which is why during G20, the dogs were being hidden, but the poor were also being hidden. So it is not a versus category at all. Now, building on this framework, we can further look at the work of Jonathan Saha, who examined British attitudes towards human-animal interactions in colonial Burma, highlighting the rise of scientific and detached approach to animals as a key aspect of colonial experience. British colonizers distanced themselves physically and emotionally from the animal world, reducing animals to object of conservation. Saha argues that material interactions, particularly involving touch, could evoke emotional responses. So when you touch an animal, you feel something. So distancing was an important part of the colonial project. It was something that allowed the manifestation of regulatory and medical intervention, bureaucratic animal management, and educational zoo displays. So in order to do this to animals, you have to be emotionally detached to the animals. Such practices reflected the colonial effort to control and exploit nature through scientific frameworks. Interestingly, the only animal, and that is why the dog is interesting, the only animal with which the British colonizers had an emotional encounter were those that were designated as pets. Apart from dogs and pets, they were physically or emotionally distanced from most animals. Now, Sarah Meacham's study on 18th century Chesapeake slavery also tells us about the evolution of pet keeping in the British colonial world. Now let's talk a little bit about the history of pets and pet keeping. In the late 17th century, English people largely viewed associating with animals as degrading. But even when by 16th century, pet keeping had already begun amongst English royalty. Eventually by 18th century, and this is therefore not a very historical thing, by 18th century pet keeping had become more common, especially among the English middle class. By this period, British colonizers in America began to refer to the animals they held in high regard as favorites. So the term pet was not used. They would use the term favorite for animals. Favorites were a flexible category. They included pure breed animals, but also, working animals, which were regarded as with particular favor. Now, what was this pet keeping about? So Meacham says that the elites in Chesapeake, they kept favorites as the practice provided them with the validation of their social status and control over nature. So this is the birth of pet keeping, reinforcing their sense of paternalism, she says, where they ruled over and expected obedience from both humans and animals. It is important because even today when we keep pets in our house, if the pet is not obedient, then it is not a part of the house, right? Now, keeping favorites also had gendered aspects, as it reinforced traditional gender roles where men and boys typically displayed larger and more majestic animals, what we see especially coming from Punjab and pit bulls, while women and girls were associated with smaller animals like squirrels and birds. This gender dynamic reflected the white woman's authority within the household over slaves and animals alike. In all of this, the mongrel dog were kept by smaller artisans, servants and slaves for hunting and protection. So since the very beginning, the mongrel dog was associated with the poor, with the slave for protection. Now, examining the Victorian obsession with pure breed dogs, Harriet Reitvo has argued that the pure breed animals were preferred not only for their aesthetic qualities, they were cute, fluffy, but also for the social distinctions they signified. Reitvo observes that pure breed dogs were associated with leisure and affluence, traits that were inaccessible to the working class because people did not have the time to look after these pets. So the maintenance of expensive pets in the house required resources and time aligning with bourgeois ideals. So capitalism also enters here. The practice of pure breed pet keeping contradicted with working class values of hard work, industry, thrift, and not wasting money on non-utilitarian animals. So the working classes associated with working animals. The upper classes associated with pedigree pets. Accordingly, the British, historically for the British, non-pure breed dog had low status connotations, because of which the Indian street dog became a particular object of disdain. Far from being pure breed, the Indian street dog had discursive associations that connected it with poorer Indian masses. The import of pedigree dogs in India therefore needs to be viewed through the lens of what Cohen calls animal colonialism, a phenomenon with two dimensions. First, it involves not only the use of animals to facilitate colonization of lands, native species and people, but also the imposition of foreign legal frameworks that govern human-animal relations on local communities and environments. In today's context, this is reflected in the frequent comparisons with the West, where the absence of street dogs is often cited as a model way of urban life. America mein to nahi hai, right? UK mein to nahi hai street dogs. What is overlooked, however, is that this absence is first of all the result of killing unadopted dogs because of the kill shelters. Secondly, when we say that, we should kind of do what Americans do, it is basically an implicit call to import Western model of animal governance in India, similar to what Cohen calls animal colonialism. Now, explaining this process of animal colonialism further, Cohen notes how historically colonizers utilized animals as instruments of conquest, from Columbus introducing livestock to the Caribbean, to British settlers bringing sheep to Australia. The introduction of European animals coupled with the eradication of native species was often justified by claims of advancing agriculture, health, modernity. Moreover, animals were legally designated as property at this time, solidifying the notion of animals as human possessions. Now let's contrast this. Now if we come to today's time, this is the colonial history. If we come to today's time and contrast the free roaming status of the post-independent Indian street dog becomes particularly relevant. The ABC rules established under the Prevention of Cruelty to Animals Act 1960 were originally formulated to promote humane management of street dog population, replacing colonial practice of mass culling through poisoning and electrocution. The significance of this law can be highlighted by referring to Palsettia's work. It's a very nice article, who argues that the standard response the British had towards any animal-related issue in India was the indiscriminate killing of livestock, pigs, poultry, and of course dogs. She argues that this was of course representative of a difference in cultural attitudes. Indians opposed this constantly because, for example, Parsis had a religious reverence for dogs, and Hindus and Jains, they had a culturally caring attitude towards animals for both religious merit and piety. British, on the other hand, saw the dogs as going mad in the Indian summer heat and biting and spreading rabies and things like that. Now, it would be inaccurate, however, to say that the disdain towards Indian street dogs was entirely a colonial import. That's not what I'm saying. As paradoxical references to dogs can also be found within Hindu scriptures. Kaminska-Jones, for example, highlights the Rig-Vedic portrayal of dogs as Vastopati, which is the protector of the house. But she also says that there is a possible shifting of attitudes with the Brahmanical influences as seen in Manusmriti, where dogs were linked to impurity and associated with unclean castes. Now, these textual references reveal that the contempt toward the street dogs in India cannot be disentangled from the broader histories of caste and purity. The disdain often intersects with the ideals of vegetarianism, which I argue, and this is also an important point because this ideals of vegetarianism is, I argue, is not necessarily a sign of compassion towards animals, but a sign of caste-based distancing. This challenges the popular narrative that vegetarianism in India reflects animal love. This representation was even raised in the court last week, where the question emerged on how people who can consume chicken claim the mantle of being animal lovers. I don't know how many of you heard this. The point here is that non-vegetarian communities, being largely non-Brahmanical, did not view dogs as impure, unlike the Brahmanical counterparts, thus complicating the association between diet and attitude towards animals. Nevertheless, despite these negative depictions, dogs retain divine associations. They were Bhairav's steed, Indra's celestial. Indian epics like the Ramayana, Mahabharata often portrayed dogs favorably, highlighting moral lessons and their protective roles. What is relevant here is that while texts may have displayed a mix of reverence and disdain for dogs, but the systematic eradication of dogs and these dog removal drives through poisoning, electrocution, whatever, is a uniquely colonial imposition of a biopolitical measure rather than being an indigenous practice. And equally colonial was the preference for dogs based on the notions of racial superiority. So there are two colonial imports. One is the removal drives that we see, another is the preference for breeds. Now, it is in this context that the ABC rules, which is a source of conflict in India today, it becomes particularly important because it stands as a distinctly anti-colonial legal framework, advocating coexistence with non-pedigree street dogs who have historically played an important role in the everyday life of the urban poor in India. Now, it is important to understand how these dogs have been connected to the urban poor. To understand this, we have to think a little, we have to talk a little about this dog-human interaction. It is not random, and studies have shown, there are studies on why dogs interact with what kind of people and why. Now, just to give a very brief, understanding of how dogs behave, again I refer to the work of Rishi Dev, and he says that, the behavior of the dog depends upon what he calls spatial geographies. Now, in Delhi, dogs occupy diverse locations. They are in residential colonies, side lanes, roads, markets, bus stops, garbage dumps. The behavior of dog is going to depend upon where it is found. Furthermore, so each space produces a different kind of dog-human interaction. Now, furthermore, the kind of groups that the dogs interact with is also going to change their behavior. So, EWS workers, hawkers, guards, morning walkers, school children, these are, and studies have shown how, how they interact with which group. Now, broadly, they've argued that these interactions are shaped by what are called niche. Niche is basically a micro-habitat that a location provides for a dog. Niches are defined by physical, social, ecological parameters, which are often marked by invisible boundaries created by a complex set of factors. So there is something called the ecological niche of dogs, which depends upon resources like food, water, shelter. So when people say कि इसको खाना खिला रहे हो, and that is just the ecological niche. Now, ecological niche basically makes the dog stay in a locality, right? Whereas stray dogs, for example, because they do not have a specific ecological niche, they roam around to larger, spaces and larger areas. There is also something called the psychological niche, which extends beyond survival. It includes sound, smell. These are also factors which help a dog create territories. And then there is something called a social niche. Dogs are pack animals and they build complex relations with humans. And dogs are one of the only species which can coexist even with adversaries. Now, the thing with the poor, the EWS localities, and why, going back to my previous question, why, finding pedigree dogs in EWS localities, it kind of impacts the larger multi-species relations in the city is because EWS localities have provided stronger social niche compared to affluent or gated societies of Delhi NCR. That is, dogs feel better protected in EWS localities compared to the affluent localities. The assumption is कि भाई affluent locality है तो वहाँ पे खाना मिल जाएगा, which is actually not the case. Interestingly. Now, Rishidev again highlights how street dogs feel better protected and in turn provide valuable services such as guarding homes, livelihood spaces like those of the thela walas and other street vendors who can pack their shops up and go primarily because there are dogs. Now, for this, it also enables greater interaction between dogs and humans, because if you have seen EWS houses, they open directly onto the streets. Unlike gated colonies जहाँ पे guard है, gate है, things like that, EWS houses open directly on the streets, which basically indicates that there will be a greater interaction between dogs and humans. Now, what one is trying to argue is that EWS communities have told us, have allowed us to understand how dogs can live in sustainable and functional relations with humans, in contrast to the sentimental relations which exist with high-rise buildings. Again, I'm trying to explain this. In upper class or high-rise societies, we find how dogs and humans have more of a sentimental relation. In EWS locations, dogs live, as a more functional, they offer a kind of a functional relationship to humans. Now, having said this, it is also so, dogs, of course, they provide, kind of function, but, they also bite. And then there is rabies and things like that. So the presence of dogs has generated immense conflict and also fatal outcomes. One of my respondents had said to me that the thing with dogs is that they have entered the human psyche to such an extent that humans have become against other humans for the protection of this species. And that is a way in which dogs are able to survive amongst humans, right? So they have developed that bond with a certain section of humans, creating conflict between, human-human conflict. Now, so there is a duality where the dogs are simultaneously loved, but they are also despised or feared. And scholars have argued that we cannot use the term emotion to describe what is happening here. Rather, we understand the contemporary human-dog relation through the concept of affect, right? And, what does affect mean? The idea that human-dog relations cannot be seen as just a private, isolated, anthropomorphic emotion. It is not just enough to say that I love a dog, right? There is something more happening here. What we find is that this duality, this binary between the dog lover and the dog hater, it is problematic because in the last week we have seen that even those who do not want the dogs around them have come out and said that the mass removal should not happen, right? So just dog love or emotion is not the accurate way to sociologically look at this phenomenon. So we have to rather look at dogs as not as passive objects of care or regulation, but as active agents challenging political, legal, and capitalistic definitions of urban space and who belongs in urban spaces. The dog-human relationship, is just one. There have been studies which have looked at other kinds of relationships. For example, Barua's study on the monkeys of Delhi indicates how human-animal interactions create alternative spaces of well-being. Barua has looked at how Together monkeys and humans have created micro spaces of well-being. If you go to the Hanuman Mandir, right, in CP, and this allows people to mitigate the stress of urban life. Similarly, Gudgutia has studied pigs, right, and Gudgutia's paper examines how pigs function as infrastructure within human settlements. Why? Because pigs consume waste and they inhabit broken spaces and they reintegrate discarded materials into circuits of value, right? So, interaction between city animals and humans, whether through feeding, companionship or other daily encounters, forms a vital kind of an affective relationship that challenges rigid urban planning policies. Finally, it is because of this, I argue, that EWS localities, when we see that they are buying pedigrees, it is not simply a matter of, again I say, preference, because pedigree dogs are, often abandoned by people who cannot afford to kind of keep them. Eventually, these dogs, they become a part of the already existing street dog population, right? The population increases, and then there are these dog removal drives which are undertaken by authorities. And many of these interventions, far from resolving conflict, often produce new ecological instabilities. And I just want to quickly talk about one particular study by Karlekar, and he has looked at how pharmaceutical companies have funded biased surveys to promote anti-rabies vaccines, which are otherwise in fact low in demand. So the point is that, there are these numbers that there are 20,000 rabies and things like that, whereas the government data says that since 2022 there's not been a single rabies death in Delhi. So if there's been not a single rabies death in Delhi, then why this drive in Delhi, right? So this is what Karlekar is also saying, that there's a vaccine market manipulation through the example of Bangalore, where although rabies deaths had significantly decreased due to the ABC program, culling was reintroduced to artificially create demand for vaccines. Karlekar points out how fear and misinformation were used to boost the vaccine market, leading to unnecessary culling, and it ultimately increased the migration of dogs into urban areas. Because dogs, if you remove one set of dogs, you will have another set of dogs the next day, right? What you are ultimately doing is you are removing vaccinated dogs, friendly dogs, and you are bringing in aggressive, unvaccinated, unsterilized dogs. So that's it has happened in Bangalore already. It's kind of getting repeated in Delhi. In fact, Karlekar has also looked at other countries where, in US, where bird flu, a public health crisis was, how the bird flu was used to artificially create a public health crisis for the generation of profit and vaccines and things like that. Now, so what we see, and this is what I'm trying to say here, is that the relationship between humans and street dogs in Indian cities, it is an important way to look at the broader themes of colonialism, contemporary urban governance, and the politics of space. What I've tried to do today is I've tried to highlight the participation of street dogs in urban life, not merely as nuisances, but as active agents, shaping and being shaped by the socio-political life of the city. Their presence disrupts conventional notions of urban planning. Street dogs, cows, pigs, they challenge the clean, sanitized vision of a world-class city that seeks to exclude non-human lives. Rather than relying on binaries of affection and threat, I have tried to argue for a context-sensitive and law-informed framework that addresses both human and animal vulnerabilities. Taken together, I want to argue that the legal and the constitutional and the legal and the constitutional frameworks matter. The ABC rules and the constitutional provisions collectively promote coexistence with animals. They are not simply driven by sentiments, but a broader normative and legal framework informed by India's colonial imaginaries. Therefore, reframing the urban, what I'm trying to say is that it is the urban which has to be reframed as a multi-species space. And by this reframing, we'll be able to see the animals, street dogs and other city animals, as actors whose presence shapes and contests the production of urban life in India and dismantles the colonial and capitalist interpretation of the city as an exclusively human space.